Good morning. It's good to be with you all. As was announced, we're going to be looking at the life of Elijah. So following Elijah the prophet, I figured it was what we're doing at the congregation that I am working with back in Kentucky is currently that we are going through the Bible lands and just going through the geography of that time. And the man that is doing it, the preacher there, he was out of town last week, and so I filled in for him. And this is the lesson that I chose. It's just a one-off class that hopefully will help you be able to better picture the life of Elijah. And so when you read the Bible stories, you can picture in your mind where it took place, what was happening at that time, what the landscape looks like, and there's some quite a few pictures to show what all that means. This is the map that we're going to be looking at a lot. I meant to print some of these off for y'all to have, but for most of it, it's just going to be up there. Some of y'all might have maps in the back of your Bibles, and so you can kind of follow along or mark in places that your map does not have. But if you want to go ahead and open up to 1 Kings 17, that's where we first learn of the prophet Elijah. 1 Kings 17. The first question is, where is Elijah from? Does anyone know the answer?
The Tishbite. So
Right. He's called Elijah the Tishbite. And so it's kind of in the middle of the map up there, and he would be from Tishbe. There it is, right there on the east side of the Jordan River. So verse 1 of chapter 17 says, Now Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the settlers of Gilead, said to Ahab, As the Lord God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, surely there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word. So the first time we hear of Elijah, and the first thing that's said to him is about how the Lord is going to have him go tell Ahab that there's going to be no rain on the land. But Tishbe is where he was from. And so we learn that in the first verse of chapter 17. And this is an area that would be very rugged hillside. The land east of the Jordan, there's a mountain ridge that goes up along the west side. And so all the weather that would be coming off the sea, a lot of the rain, a lot of that good fertile ground is going to be on the west side of the Jordan, closer to the Mediterranean Sea. And so the area that he is from is rugged. It's often much more dry. And so the region is really just known for its toughness and for its isolation and for things like that. And so God is raising up this prophet from out of the wilderness, essentially. This would be considered the wilderness lands where Elijah is coming from. And so he gets this command from God. And one of the things I want us to notice as we are going through here is going to be the word go. We're going to see it repeatedly in verse 3, go away from here. In verse 9, arise, go. And then if you go to chapter 18, we see it in verse 1 there. In chapter 19, it's all over there. And then chapter 21, go. And so it's God's command to Elijah, go, go, go. And we'll see that. And so really, Elijah's traveling all over the place with God's command. When we think about other prophets like Jeremiah or Isaiah, they were really pretty much in one location. Jeremiah was in Jerusalem. He was near Jerusalem, and he didn't really travel around. But Elijah is sent all over the land of the Israelites, or the promised land. And so his first place that he is told to go, and let's read verses 2 and 3. The word of the Lord came to him, saying, Go away from here and turn eastward and hide yourself by the brook Cherith, which is east of the Jordan River. And so the question that comes up is, if Elijah is from Tishbe, you can see the Cherith Brook is directly underneath. How is it that he was able to go east after giving the command to Ahab? Well, you have to figure out where it would have been that he went to tell Ahab that there was going to be no rain. And so where was Ahab's palace, or where did Elijah prophesy to Ahab? And we have two different options, Jezreel or Samaria. The first one, Jezreel, if you look at 21, 1 Kings 21, And during the story of Naboth's vineyard and all that, we're told that in verse 1 of 21 that Ahab has a palace in Jezreel, and he was king of Samaria, right? And so that's the first option, is Jezreel. Ahab had a palace. It's often said that this was his secondary palace, and so the more likely option for where Elijah is going and talking to him would have been Samaria, which is where his father in 1 Kings chapter 16 built a palace. And so his father Omri, in verse 23 and 24, the 31st year of Ahaziah, or Asa, king of Judah, Omri became king over Israel and reigned 12 years. He reigned 6 years with Tirzah. He bought the hill of Samaria from Shamir for 2 talents of silver, and on the hill built on the hill and named the city which he built Samaria. Thereafter Shamir, the owner of the hill. And then Omri dies and sleeps with his fathers, and we have Ahab, his son, taking his place and reigning in Samaria. So most likely it was Samaria, but some people will bring up the idea, well, if he was from Tishbe, why is he going east, right? Well, either option has him going east across the Jordan back to the Cherith Brook. And so what happens at the Cherith Brook? Do you guys remember? When it comes to the life of Elijah, the drought is started. Right. He is fed by ravens, and these ravens are sent by God to take care of him, to give him food. And that stays going for quite a long time, and it's all good and happy until what? What happens? You can read verse.
Dries up.
Right. In verse 7, the brook dries up. And so then in verse 8, then the word of the Lord came to him. This is in chapter 17, sorry. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and stay there. Behold, I have commanded a widow to provide for you. So we have the next trip that Elijah is going to take is from the Cherith Brook up north to Zarephath, which is on the coast. It's a coastal city, but it's also technically not part of the land of Israel. And so he's leaving the land of Israel, going to foreign nation, going to Sidon, and living with a widow there. And so it is where he's going to meet the widow who is going to die. He meets her and he says, will you give me some water? And she's like, sure, I'll give you water. And he's like, what about some bread? And she goes, well, that's the thing. I'm going to go make some bread for me and my son. We're going to cook it and then we're going to die. And so that's the whole idea behind how he first meets this widow that he's going to live with. But do you guys remember what happens during the rest of the story? Right. He says, if you will make me a piece of bread or something to eat, then God will take care of you. And so what happens is she does it in good faith. She does it. And then she's taken care of, and the oil and the flour do not run out. And then after quite a long time of him living there and them being fed off of this never-ending oil and flour jars, what happens?
Her son dies.
Right, her son dies. And then, does he stay dead? No. Elijah raises him up from the dead. And so all of that is happening in Zarephath, there in a foreign country with foreign people, and yet God is still taking care of him and taking care of the people that are around him, because Elijah goes where God tells him to go. Now, an interesting point about how Elijah raises the widow's son from the dead here in Zarephath is that when Jesus comes onto the earth, he is going to raise someone from the dead in that same area, that same region north of the Sea of Galilee, in the land of the Gentiles. He is going to raise a widow's son again. And some say that it's on the same hill, just on the opposite side of the hill. So it's kind of a big hill area. And then the city Zarephath that Elijah was in is closer to the Mediterranean, and the one where Jesus raised the widow, tradition says that it was on just the opposite side of that hill. And so it would have been very fresh in their memory, and they would have had this passed down through generations that there had been someone raised from the dead there before. And so now we have Jesus coming and doing it again in that same spot. And these people are going to realize that there's an even greater prophet, or here's another prophet come to us, which many of the prophecies spoke about. Okay, let's go to 1 Kings 18. Anyone have any comments, questions so far? If you do, feel free to just raise your hand or interrupt me at any point. Okay, 1 Kings 18, 1 through 42. We're not going to read all of that, but this is one of those places where you'll see that word go quite a lot, especially close to the end of the chapter, and it's going to shift from God telling Elijah to go to Elijah speaking God's commands to other people, telling them, go, 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 go. And they're going to go where he says to go. But we have the whole story of the widow and Elijah living with her. And now in verse 1 of chapter 18, it says, "Now it happened after many days that the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year, saying, Go, show yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the face of the earth." And so after 3 years of famine and drought, no rain at all, Elijah is told to go back to Ahab, and there will be rain. And so in verse 2, it says, Elijah went to show himself to Ahab. Now the famine was severe in Samaria. So I don't know if Elijah goes officially to Samaria, because the story that we will read about in just a second, about how Ahab, or I'll tell you, about how Ahab and Obadiah go out, and they're going to look for springs, maybe a river somewhere for the sheep and their cattle to drink from so that they won't die. And so Obadiah goes one way and Ahab goes the other way, and Obadiah runs into Elijah. And when they run into each other, Elijah tells him, "Go say to your master, behold, Elijah is here." And that is what he tells Obadiah. And Obadiah says, "I don't think I want to do this, because I'm going to go tell Ahab that you're here, and then we're going to come back here, and then you're not going to be here, and then I'm not going to be here either because I'm going to be dead." And so that's what Obadiah is thinking in his head, is that if he goes, he's going to die, because Elijah's not going to stay there as long as it's going to take him. But they're going around, they're looking for this water and all that, and ends up that Ahab comes, and he comes to see Elijah. And in verse 17, Ahab says to Elijah, when he sees him, "Is this you, O troubler of Israel?" And Elijah responds with, "I know you are, but what am I?" Basically flipping it on his head and saying, "No, Ahab, you're the reason for all the drought. You're the reason you and your father have continued to worship Baal. You have continued to worship the false gods. And so you guys are the reason that any of this even happened. This 3 years of famine, that you are the reason that this happened." And even though Ahab thinks it's Elijah because Elijah was the messenger of God, he thinks that it's his fault, and he's not willing to look at himself and realize that the consequences are because of him. When God promised the land of Israel or the land of Canaan to the Israelites, it was not a great land. It was a great land because God makes it a great land, because God sends the water. He continues to bless it. But God says, if you don't follow me, what will happen? You'll be punished. The land will be cursed, right? And so if you go back to Deuteronomy, you can read through the list of blessings. Some of the blessings there: you'll be fruitful, you'll multiply, your grain will multiply, your fruit trees will bear fruit, the land will be green and lush. And then on the curses side, in Deuteronomy, it talks about how if you do not worship me, if you do not follow my commands, then the land will be barren. It will hate you. It will spew you out, right? And so that's what's happening. We're having the fulfillment of those curses. They had the option between the blessings and the curses, and now they're receiving the curses. And so Elijah meets up with Ahab. Ahab realizes that, or Elijah tells Ahab, "This is your fault, and now we're going to prove it." And he proves it on Mount Carmel. And so what's going to happen? What is the command Elijah gives to Ahab? He says, "Go meet me on Mount Carmel," and do what? And bring who?
Prophets. Baal,
Right. How many of those?
450.
450 prophets of Baal, and then there were 400 more prophets of another god, Asherah. And it says in verse 19, and they all ate at Jezebel's table. And so Jezebel, Ahab's wife, all of these prophets were associated with the king and his wife. And so they're all told to meet at Mount Carmel. But Mount Carmel is one of those places that was associated with Baal worship. And so Elijah's even choosing to go to a place that is associated with the worship of Baal. And so it's technically another foreign country. In other words, you could look at it in that way. And so we have Mount Carmel on the very west side by the Mediterranean Sea there. And this is the great showdown of the Bible. So many times we read this, especially when we were growing up in the children's classes, talking about Elijah and how he wins this great victory, and it is very cool. But we're going to slow down a little bit and read through this and just look at it a little closer to see some of the details here. So we have him going to Mount Carmel here. This is a very cool picture, I think, of Mount Carmel and how close it would have been to the Mediterranean Sea. And we'll point some more things out as we go through. But let's go ahead and start in verse 20 and just read a little bit down. So Ahab sent a message among the sons of Israel and brought the prophets together at Mount Carmel. Elijah came near to all the people and said, "How long will you hesitate between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him." But the people did not answer him a word. Then Elijah said to the people, "I alone am left, a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450. Now give us 2 oxen, and let them choose 1 ox for themselves and cut it up and place it on the wood, but put no fire under it. And I will prepare the other ox, lay it on the wood, and I will put no fire under it. Then you will call on the name of God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. And the God who answers by fire, he is God." And all the people say, "That is a good idea." Okay, so of course we have this challenge here where there's 2 oxen brought, and Elijah even says, give them the first choice. They get to choose which ox. They're going to build the altar, and they're going to go ahead and do whatever they do, but no fire. You got to get fire to come down from heaven, come down from your God, and that's going to prove whose God is really the true God. And so all the people are like, sounds good to me. Sounds like a cool show. Let's get it on. And so the prophets of Baal cut up their ox, and they prepare their altar. And in verse 26, it says, "And from morning until noon, the prophets of Baal shouted, 'O Baal, answer us.' But there was no voice, no one answered, and they leapt about the altar which they had made." So for hours, they're shouting out to Baal. They are crying out to him, "Answer us, bring fire down." They're leaping around, jumping around, probably 450 men doing this in whatever priestly garments they would wear, or whatever it was, would be a pretty funny sight. And so we have Elijah then, in verse 27, it come about at noon that Elijah's now mocking them. After hours and hours of this going on, Elijah's like, "You guys are a complete joke. How about you call out with a louder voice? Speak up. Maybe he can't hear you." He says, "For he is a god. Either he is occupied or gone aside, or is on a journey, or perhaps he's asleep and needs to be awakened." And then they do it. They listen to Elijah in verse 28. "So they cried out with a loud voice and cut themselves according to their custom with swords and lances until the blood gushed out of them." And so they're just making complete fools of themselves. Elijah's saying maybe he's on a journey. It's kind of interesting that he says maybe he's on a journey, because what have we seen this whole time? God is sending Elijah on all the journeys. God doesn't go on the journeys. He's sending others. And because God is everywhere at all times, and he's accomplishing his purpose through the prophets, through those that he has chosen. But in verse 29, it says, "And midday was past, they raved until the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice." So they're going all the way until the evening. The evening sacrifice took place anywhere from around 4 to 6 p.m. And so they've started all the way in the morning and they've gone until 4 to around 6 o'clock at night. And it says there was no voice, no one answered, and no one paid attention. So now it's Elijah's turn. After the prophets of Baal have completely and utterly failed, and they're all weak and tired and probably have lost their voice and lost even more blood, Elijah's calling all the people to come to him in verse 30. And he says, "Come near to me." And so all the people came near to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. Why had the altar of the Lord been torn down? Right.
Disbelief.
And so what did we say Mount Carmel was used for just a little bit ago? Baal worship. So they tore down the altar of Baal. And so during this whole picture, you can imagine there's this crumpled altar of Baal over there on that side. And then just a couple yards over on this other side, there's this altar to God. Sorry, the altar to God would have been the one crumpled down. And then the altar to Baal would have been built up and right there. And so they're leaping around that one. Elijah's probably over there by these ruins. And he rebuilds these ruins. And then what does he tell the people to do? They put wood on it. They lay the ox on it. They dig a trench. And what do they fill the trench with? Water. Where would they have gotten water if it was a drought? Well, yeah, right? I mean, it's right there. There have been people, skeptics of the Bible, that say, if it was a drought, there's no way they could have gotten water. Well, obviously, they have no idea where Mount Carmel was, right? They think Mount Carmel is in the middle of the land. But no, it's right there by the Mediterranean River. And also, another key spot is this. Can you see that blue line? It just appeared over there on the side. That's the brook Kishron, and very well could have still had water in it, because that is a spring fed brook, little stream river there. And so they either go down the mountain to get the water, or they go to the brook to get the water. Either one, hundreds of billions of gallons of water in the Mediterranean Sea. They wouldn't have run out very quickly from there, at least, right? And so in verse 34, it says, Elijah told them to fill 4 pitchers with water and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood. And then he says, do so a second time. And they did it a second time. And he says, do so a third time. And they did it a third time. And the water flowed around the altar, and he also filled the trench with water. And so this thing is absolutely soaking wet. Soaking wet to the point where the earth around it is now full of water. And here's another important point to remember, is that this land is currently experiencing a drought. Ground that has been completely dry for a very long time is likely to soak up water very quickly. And yet they put so much water on this particular spot that the ground isn't soaking it up anymore. It's now staying in the trenches that they have dug in this spot. And so that's just how much water is put on. And if you've ever tried to start a fire, it can be difficult. But if you've ever tried to start a fire with wet stuff, you might want to just give up. And so the prophets of Baal can't even do it with dry wood and the so-called perfect conditions, right? And so they're in an area that's completely dry. This would be, Smokey the Bear would be saying the high chance of fire, right, during this time, because throughout all the land of Israel. And yet the prophets of Baal can't do nothing. And Elijah goes, make that a low chance of fire, and then we're going to see what happens. And he's going to prove that there will be a God. And so in verse 36, we see, at the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, Elijah the prophet came near and said, O Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, today let it be known that you are the God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their heart back again. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust and licked up the water that was in the trench. When all the people saw it, they fell on their face and they said, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God." So Elijah proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Lord God, Yahweh, is the God of the Israelites. He is the God, the one and only God that can bring fire down from heaven, that not only consumes the ox and the wood, as you would expect, but that consumes the stones and the dust and all of the water that was around that altar, that was in that trench. And so it is proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that this fire was so powerful that it could consume stones, dust, and even water. And you can think now, in today's day, we have the power to heat a fire to the point where we could make stones turn into lava. But it takes a very long time. We have the ability to do that. They had the power, the ability to work with metal and things like that, and they had forges. But the chances of them seeing, of any of these people having seen stones melted at this point are very unlikely. And so it would have been something that would have been in their minds, and they would be like, okay, these stones don't even exist anymore. The dust and this water doesn't even exist anymore. So it's just an absolutely incredible miracle that God performs through the hand of Elijah. And this is the point at which Elijah begins to get the name that is often tied to him with the prophet of fire. And we see later in the book of Hebrews in chapter 11, I think we're going to read it later today for the sermon, but one of the things mentioned there is the great men of faith were able to quench the power or control the power of fire. And so that's often either a shadow back to Elijah the prophet, who uses fire multiple times. We'll see it some more where he uses fire, and then also where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are able to withstand the power of fire themselves. Okay, so this happens, and then what happens? After the sacrifice, all the people realize, what do? They fall, they worship God, and they get rid of who?
All the prophets, take them down.
Yeah. And so we see that in verse 40, Elijah tells them, "Seize the prophets of Baal, do not let one of them escape." So they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishron and slew them there. Now, so he takes all the prophets of Baal. I don't know if that would have included the prophets of Asherah as well, but we know for sure that he killed 450 prophets at least. It could have been 850. It only tells us that they seized the prophets of Baal. So we don't know if the prophets of Asherah had given up at the point where, at any point or something, or they had left. But we do know that the prophets of Baal, they were all killed. And they were killed there at the brook Kishron. And so you can just imagine them marching down, all these Israelites grabbing onto these false prophets. And they walk down the mountain, and they take them, and it's just an assembly line of pop, 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 lopping off their heads. And so that's what happens there. And it is one of the great stories of the Bible where God shows his power and shows that he truly is the God. But if you look a little closer at the geography of the Mount Carmel, is that it's a mountain. It's got some pretty steep cliffs, but it's kind of sloped when it goes down to the brook Kishron. But the top of it would be relatively flat. And this picture has it pretty green and lush, and that's really what it would look like when there was a lot of rain. It probably wouldn't have looked like that at this point. It probably would have been pretty bare, especially closer to the top there, and along the side that's farther away from the sea. But the top of it's pretty flat, and so you could fit a lot of people up there. And so a lot of people were able to witness this miracle that happens when Elijah calls fire down from God. And so that's just pretty cool. So next time you read this story, you can picture this mountain and say, yeah, they would have gotten water from Mediterranean. Skeptics, you're wrong, right? All that good stuff. Okay, so we have the next command to go in verse 41. Now Elijah said to Ahab, "Go up, eat and drink, for there is the sound of a roar of a heavy shower." And so Ahab went up to eat and drink, but Elijah went to the top of Mount Carmel. He crouched down on the earth and put his face between his knees. He said to his servant, "Go up now, look towards the sea." So he went up, looked, and said, "There is nothing." Then he said, "Go back 7 times. And it came about the 7th time that he said, "Behold, a cloud so small as a man's hand is coming up from the sea." And he said, "Go up and say to Ahab, prepare your chariot and go down, so that the heavy shower does not stop you." And in a little while the sky grew black with clouds and wind, and there was a heavy shower, and Ahab rode and went to Jezreel. Then the hand of the Lord was on Elijah, and he girded up his loins and outran Ahab to Jezreel. So we have this little side story where they're going around. Ahab's told to go eat, get ready for the journey. They're going to travel from Mount Carmel to Jezreel, and the servant goes, and Elijah and the servant go back up onto the mountain, and Elijah sends a servant, "Go look, see if there's any clouds coming from the Mediterranean Sea." And finally, on the 7th time, there is some coming. And then he tells Ahab, "The rain is coming, go." And the reason he probably tells him this is because they're going to have this 17-mile journey across this flat plain, this flat area in between Mount Carmel and Jezreel. In this area, all the water would run down into it. And so this was a very fertile area when there was rain. This is a very muddy area when there was rain. And so Ahab needs to get going before his chariot can't get through this muddy area. This flat area was also known as the Chariots Arena during this time. And so you of course you have Galilee up there, Carmel, Jezreel, and Samaria. So that's what's around it. But we're also told that Elijah outruns his chariot, that God is able to strengthen him, and that he girds up his loins and outran Ahab to Jezreel. Ahab, with his horses and his chariots, is able to go pretty fast. Yet Elijah is able to run even faster. What are some other times in the Bible where someone's able to outrun a chariot or catch up to a chariot? Right, Philip and the eunuch. And there's also Jehu a little later on. Jehu, when he's fulfilling God's commands to kill all of Ahab's descendants, he's going to outrun a chariot, and they're going to be amazed by that as well. But here Elijah is outrunning a chariot, and he runs 17 miles. It's estimated to be 17 miles from Carmel to the ancient site of Jezreel. And so it's a pretty good run. And yet he's able to beat Ahab at that run. And I kind of just imagine like Elijah's running along, and there's Ahab, and Ahab's in his chariot, and he looks down, he's like, "Whoa, this guy is," right? And he's burning rubber, going so fast. So now we're in the city of Jezreel, and 1 Kings 19 tells us what happens there. 1 Kings 19, 1-4. Now Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So he gets home, he does the little debrief. He's like, all these dudes that eat at your table, that you know personally probably, they're all dead now. And Jezebel does not like that. And so Jezebel sends a messenger in verse 2 to Elijah saying, "So may the gods do to me, and even more, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow at this time." So Elijah was afraid and rose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah. And he left his servant there, but he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came down and sat under a juniper tree. And he requested himself that he might die, and said, "It is enough now, O Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my father's." And so Elijah comes off of this great victory. And then just a couple verses later, we find him saying, "I'm done. I want to be done. I'm ready to die. Just take my life. I'm tired of running." And Jezebel is saying that I'm going to kill you. And so he realizes that, and he thinks it's a real threat. And so he's going to run all the way from Jezreel down to Beersheba, which is almost the entire length of the promised land. The Bible talks about it, it says from Gad to Beersheba. Gad would be just north of the Sea of Galilee. And so he's running all that way. He leaves his servant at Beersheba, and then he goes a little bit farther down there into the wilderness. And you can see there's a small little note that says to Mount Sinai. Well, that's where Elijah's going to go. Because in verse 8, it says, so he arose, ate and drank, and went with strength of that food for 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. Mount Horeb, the mountain of God, is also known as Mount Sinai. So he goes from Beersheba into the greater Negev, which is just the Hebrew word for dry wilderness, desert land. Right after God had sent rain onto the land of Israel, Elijah is forced out by Jezebel, and he leaves and he goes back into a desert. You would think after all those years of being so dry, of having no water, that he would want to stick around a little bit longer, but he's not able to. He has to go deep into the desert, going to Mount Sinai, and it's interesting how it gives us that note that he went for 40 days and 40 nights. Who else goes for 40 days and 40 nights into the wilderness? Jesus. There's a lot of connections about who and about who Elijah is and how that is going to be seen later in the greater prophet, which is Jesus. And so he's a bit of a foreshadowing. There's the whole thing with John the Baptist and Elijah, the forerunner, and then we have Elijah and passing his responsibilities on to Elisha, who is the greater prophet. So we see a lot of these foreshadowings through the life. We had how Elijah raised someone from a widow's son from the dead in the same area as where Jesus will eventually raise someone from the dead. Elijah is able to help this widow. If she's willing to give him food, there will be never-ending food, bread, right? Jesus comes and gives the bread of life. All these pretty cool connections that you can go back and look at more. But he travels for 40 days and 40 nights, which is a shadow of Christ. And if you look there, let's go ahead and turn to Matthew 4 real quick and look at this. This is the temptation narrative. And in verse 2 it says, and after he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, then he became hungry. And so he goes, and this is Jesus going into the wilderness and being in there for 40 days and 40 nights. So there we see that direct connection. But then if you go into verse 18 through 21, Jesus comes out of being tempted. He's now walking by the Sea of Galilee in verse 18, and he saw two brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. And immediately they left their nets and followed him. And going from there, he saw two brothers named James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, in the boat with Zebedee, their father, mending the nets. And he called to them. And immediately they left the boat and followed him. And so Jesus is calling his first disciples after the temptation narrative, after he is being in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights in this time of very hard testing where he is tempted by Satan. And it would have been a very, very tempting, a big struggle for him. And Hebrews talks also about that, how he was tempted in all ways as we were. But then if you go back to the story of Elijah, he's in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. And then he goes to Mount Sinai, the mountain of God, and he's there and he's telling God, I'm the only one left. And what job does God give Elijah in that situation?
He lets him know there are a lot of other followers.
There's a lot of other followers, and then he gives him a job. And what's the job? He lets him know that there's a bunch of other followers, and he's comforting him in that way. And then he gives him a job or a purpose. And there's three things that he's told to go do.
Jehu.
Yes, to anoint Jehu as the next king of Israel.
Elisha.
To anoint Elisha as what? Yeah, Haziel or Haziel. Yeah, I don't entirely know how to say that one. But yeah, he's told to anoint 3 different people. And then the last one he's told to anoint is Elisha, the one that will take your place. And so it's kind of interesting that after 40 days and 40 nights of Elijah being in the wilderness, he's told, go and get the people that will take your place. And after Jesus is in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights, he goes and he gets his first disciples who are going to carry on his name, who are going to continue to teach and to preach about him. And then Elisha is going to continue to be the greater version of Elijah, right? And so it's interesting, those connections there. You also see the word go in verse 11, go forth in verse 15, go, return. So there's all these times that God is telling Elijah to go. And in that, we should kind of learn, if God tells us to go somewhere, what should be our response? We do it. Never once do we see Elijah saying, I don't want to do it. Not even when he's in this terrible state where he's just ready to die, is he saying, no, I'm not going to do it. He always is willing to do it. Okay, so Mount Sinai, he's also there. What are some key events that happen at Mount Sinai before this?
10 Commandments.
The 10 Commandments are given. There's the burning bush. There's water from the rock. We have all those instances there in Exodus where Mount Sinai, the mountain of God, takes place. The events take place there. And so it's cool to connect Elijah and the children of Israel and Moses being there. And then in verse 15 through 16, the commands that Elijah's given is just some other places. He goes to Haziel, and he anoints him as the new king of the Assyrians. And he's going to go and anoint Jehu to be the next king in Israel. And then he's going to go to Abel Moloch and anoint Elisha to be the successor to him. And then he's also going and to confront Ahab in Jezreel. He's going to take another journey to Jezreel to confront him about Naboth's vineyard and how his wife gave him that and how she really shouldn't have. And so we have all that kind of summed up there. Then we have go ahead and turn to 2 Kings. It'll be the last place we look at. 2 Kings 2. And we'll see, this is the final journey of Elijah. And so Elijah is now going to be taken up into heaven. And in verse 1 and 2, it says, and it went about that the Lord was about to take Elijah up by a whirlwind into heaven, that Elijah went with Elisha from Gilgal. And Elijah said to Elisha, stay here, please, for the Lord has sent me as far as Bethel. But Elisha said, as the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. So they went down to Bethel. And so the first place they go is from Gilgal to Bethel. And then we read that the sons of the prophets who were at Bethel came out to Elisha and said, do you know that the Lord will take away your master from you today? And he said, yes, I know. Be still. And so then in verse 4, they go from Bethel to Jericho. And from Jericho, they go to the place that is traditionally called Elijah's Hill, which is just across the Jordan, which is where he is going to be taken up into heaven. And it's interesting that this is the end of his time on earth, but he doesn't die. He's taken up into heaven, and he's going back across the Jordan to where he's from. At least he's across the Jordan. He's not really where he's from, but God is going to take him up from there. And they descend a lot. They go way down into the Jericho Jordan Valley in this last journey. And so there's a little chart to show you how the elevation changes there. But then at the end of his life, he is taken up by a whirlwind. When I was a younger kid and growing up, I was very disappointed when I found out that he was not taken up by the fiery chariot. And when you look it up, when you go and you look at the story and you type in to Google, show me pictures of Elisha's ascension into heaven, everything is going to have him riding in the back of this fiery chariot. It's going to look so cool. And sadly, that's not what happens. What happens is in verse 11, it says, they were walking along and talking, and behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses which separated the two of them, and Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. And so this fiery chariot, you can imagine them standing, talking, and then all of a sudden, fiery chariot comes through, and the whirlwind takes Elijah up into heaven. He drops his mantle. You can see that there on the ground, and Elisha is now the successor to Elijah. So that is the life of Elijah and the geography that goes along with it. Thank you very much for listening. Any comments or questions, feel free to ask me or whatever. Yes.
Interesting thing there towards the end, there's really no record that Elijah went to anoint Hazael. And
Right.
He didn't anoint Jehu because it fell to Elisha ultimately to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And he didn't, at least there's no record that he anointed Elisha. He listed him as his assistant. So, I don't know, it's like Elijah's day was had peaked, kind of, and
Right.
was kind of done.
Yeah. And so he's given this man to send the rest of your responsibilities. Make sure you go and do these things. Yeah. And so it's pretty cool how it just kind of summarizes it. And it's like, you've accomplished a lot. Thank you. God now gives him someone else to take his place. Right. Any other comments or questions? All right. Thank you very much.